We're going to kick off this afternoon with JLL and hearing from two of our expert speakers, just wonderful people that we've worked with for many, many years here at NASCA. Herman Bowles is the Vice Chairman of the Americas with JLL, and then Bernice Boucher is the Managing Director of JLL Consulting. I'm excited to have Scott Wayne from our Richmond studio with me today to just have a conversation. And Scott, I know a lot's happened since we first heard from JLL back in November. So I know you're ready to jump in with Herman and Bernice and see what's new.
I am. Herman, Bernice, switch on your cameras. Do join us. Looking forward to this conversation because nobody has returned to the office on their minds at the moment. It's not at the top of every HR agenda. Actually, it's not at the top of every board meeting about how we get people back to the workplace. So I'm going to follow that British tradition. I don't know if you've ever watched Prime Minister's Question Times in Parliament, but the rules of procedure is you have to let the Prime Minister know the first question that you ask, but you're allowed a follow-up question. So we're going to follow a format of I'm going to ask you a layup question, and then the top ones follow that. So get ready for that. How this works in Parliament, by the way, is it looks something like this, as I would say, Prime Minister, what's your agenda for the day? And after the Prime Minister told Parliament what his agenda for the day is, I ask him why he's destroying the global economy single-handedly. So it's going to be soft and gentle like that. You both ready? I love it.
We're ready, Scott.
We're ready.
All right. Okay. All right. So it's on everybody's mind. How do we get people back to work? We're in the middle of a pandemic, an economic recession. We're in the midst of huge social justice debates and protests and counter-arguments. We've had the events in Congress over the past few days. And now we're saying we're trying to return to some degree of normalcy. So what are organizations, companies, government agencies, federal agencies, what are they all thinking about right now? And what are some of the latest strategies around return to work?
Well, Scott, I'll start out. And looking at it from a broad perspective, I think every organization, the first thing they're thinking about is their people, right? So you want to make sure during these transient crises that you go to, that you maintain the culture and make sure people know that you care about the employees that are doing the work. So that is far and foremost number one. Number two, you've got to think about your customers or your clients and making sure that whatever service or product that you're producing, that you're doing it in such a way that it's safe for them as well, and that you're taking into account not only their short-term, but their long-term needs. And then last but not least, particularly corporations and certainly states have to think the same thing. You're thinking about your other stakeholders, the communities in which you work, and how is it that you're, should I say, setting the right example to making sure that people can safely add value. And then the other thing that certainly, and Bernice will certainly know about this, that this is doing, it is, I'd say the digital transformation is coming on more because you've got to continually think and innovate and how can I continue to provide a high level of service and products to my customers. Bernice, that's from a macro perspective.
Macro, and then, 100% agree with Herman around people need to come first. In fact, our latest research we just published this week is that the number one concern of companies around the globe is around their employees' health and well-being. And that is there are challenges all around the globe, not just with the pandemic, the social unrest, et cetera, around the globe. So focusing on their health and well-being and not being afraid to talk about some of the issues or not being afraid to ask people how they're doing in one-on-ones. And I would say this, that both the Harvard Business Review and McKinsey published great pieces last week on just these topics, how to have these conversations. It's not easy. A lot of people want to avoid some of those tough questions, but this is one of those times where, because of the stress that we're all under, that it's important to open up that dialogue and have those discussions around how people are feeling, and not just throw out the usual platitudes, that you can get sometimes, but actually have one-on-one conversations with people about the tough topics.
So Bernice, it's interesting that you work for an organization that is known for management and investment in real estate, and we're already talking about sort of mental health and employee well-being and communications. So I'd love to sort of stay in that vein of where the world of environment impacts with performance and health and all of those spaces. I think that's probably enormous value to all of our stakeholders right now. But you have this concept of environmental social governance, ESG. What is that, and how are you running your business through the lens of the environmental social governance?
And I would actually say Herman's an expert in that topic.
Yeah. Well, I'll certainly start out again, but ESG, certainly in the corporate boardrooms, that I won't even call it a buzzword. It's kind of a guiding principles. And with that, what we're talking about is environmental, social, and governance. So from the environmental perspective, this is, think about your great-great-great-grandchildren and what is it that you want them to inherit in terms of, obviously global gas effects, et cetera, et cetera. So all of those things from recycling to electric vehicles, et cetera, what decisions are we making today as responsible managers and organizations that is going to impact the future? So from energy savings to recycling to, making sure that people are aware. So that's the environmental side of it. The social side of it comes into play. Many things, Scott, you and Bernice have already mentioned, right? We've got everything, even think of COVID, is what is the issue in terms of there being equity for the distribution of the vaccine coming in right now, right? So that is certainly a social issue. The social unrest that came through due to the Floyd murder this summer, and the way that opened people's eyes to thinking about equity and how do we look at that. And then, other things, how from a social perspective, from an organization's perspective, particularly the corporation, how is it that we're using our charitable contributions? Are we taking care of the person that we play golf with on the weekend? Or are we objectively looking at it and saying, how are we impacting social justice with our philanthropy program? And then with the governance is all about accountability, okay? So from a corporate perspective, what are we doing? How are we being held accountable for it? Big issue in corporations right now, states don't have to worry about this as much, is in terms of pay. Why are we paying the CEOs and the senior managers so far? And is that pay consistent with the value they're creating, not just for the shareholders, but for also the employees, their customers, and the communities in which they operate? So the ESG is going to be something, it's a framework that I think we're going to hear more and more and more about it. And it's a good way for organizations to include states to ask themselves, how are we being great corporate citizens on behalf of not only ourselves individually, but for our state and the world?
Herman, if I can maybe ask you to expand a little bit, you talked about this being some new language in boardrooms and how this is really critical to the corporate America. But I also love how you're connecting this to our states and our state members. I'm hearing you pull out words around leadership, management, accountability. How would you encourage the state chief administrator to start looking in an ESG framework with their own teams?
Well, I think it starts with that favorite quote by one of the great philosophers of the world, Wayne Gretzky, which says that you have to skate to where the puck is going to be. And for those of you who don't know, he's a hockey player. And I think for the state administrators, Pam, this comes down to being creative. It comes down to innovative ideas, and obviously working in a framework where government, we do things the way we did them yesterday. And I think the successful and the state administrators that are going to make a difference are going to be the ones that, I won't say necessarily go against the tide, but think outside of the box and saying, how can I take all of these issues? Because remember, we started this conversation by saying it's all about the people. Even when we talked about COVID, right? We got to take care of the people. So if people feel that they're in an organization, they're in a process that is going to be fair, gives them an opportunity to come to work each day and be their authentic self, you're going to promote more. Leaders make a difference. Leaders make a difference. So if you're able to promote, inspire, and get people to understand not what objective specific thing you want them to do that day, but what is your vision for success? Is it making sure that people don't have to stand in line for things? Making sure that services are delivered on time, making sure that the right supplies are in the right place at the right time. So you teach people a vision, you give them the tools to do it, and that's the way you empower them, and that's the way organizations are successful to include states.
So I love this. This is when it gets meaty. So Herman, if I apply your ESG lens, which is thinking about sort of the societal impacts of the choices that we make, and we put it back in sort of real estate in terms of the footprint that state chief administrative officers may either operate themselves or influence through sister agencies. You're saying that as much as state treasurers are going to be under enormous pressure to balance budgets where there's significant shortfalls for most states right now, is we have to think about the social impact of, for instance, withdrawing from an office or operations property that's in a distant rural part of the state that's far from the state capital. We have to be thinking about opportunities and inclusions as it goes through, which I guess means a great deal of advocacy on the part of chief administrative officers to make the case, when the numbers might just suggest, well, if we have everybody work from home, we can just lose this cost. Like, what can you add to their armory to make that case through this ESG lens?
Yeah, well, one of the things you think of, particularly as we think of the work from home, Scott, that's a perfect example. Ask yourself, what impact is that having on, number one, hopefully everybody has the internet access, right? But without good internet access, you're not going to have the connectivity and you're not going to be able to participate. That's number one. Number two, particularly for disadvantaged groups, and I'm going to include women, minority, LGBT, those groups, if they are not able to, how do I say it, have support of one another, and they have to communicate the way we are here on this Zoom call today, they're probably not going to be as effective. So I think organizations got to ask themselves, how is it that we talked about this on the first one, seminar, how do we bring new employees into the organization? How do we make sure that the culture, remember, not all culture is good. So this is an opportunity, actually, you know, that old saying, don't waste a crisis. Okay. So you got your good old boy network, so to speak, that gets together and people don't get language. The female says something in meeting and, you know, nobody notices, and a male says it 10 minutes later. And Scott, that was a great idea. You know, those types of things that set the culture. So we have to be aware that in this new distributed work environment, that we're doing things. And this is where leadership and the managers is important. So if we're having this call and I see that Pam is not talking very much, it's up to me to draw Pam in, because I know she has some ideas if I can get her authentic feelings out. And I think managers are going to have to manage a little different in this environment to make sure that they have that inclusive organization and hear everyone's voice.
And how do you do that when we're dealing with a remote workforce? We have folks all across the state.
Yeah, you got to do it by saying that leader has to be aware. Okay, I've chaired a couple of boards, right? So a board, think about it. You've got people with several different ideas and skill sets, and then you have people with different personalities. Those that are outgoing, they're pounding on the table, they've got something to say on every issue. And then you've got other people that are probably less likely to talk. Well, that board chair's role is to make sure they adroitly pull in all of those ideas and leaders. And that's what all of our chief administrators are doing on a daily basis in their staff meetings. You know, make sure that you get everybody's input, and not a way that puts them on a spot, but a way that makes it natural that they can be authentic.
I would add to that, use technology, if you don't mind my adding a point here. Actually, technology can really help you, Pam, in this particular regard. Just saw the great notice in the chat box, right? Add your questions here. For many of the virtual engagements that we're doing, whether it's a visioning session with the C-suite or a focus group with a number of people, we're using those chat boxes, and you can have a very lively, very open discussion. You will see so much happening in the chat boxes if you open it up and people feel. Some people don't feel comfortable speaking up, but they are perfectly fine with chatting away in the chat box to share their opinions or agreeing with something or saying, oh, well, have you thought of this? So use technology as well and be more intentional, okay, around asking the questions. 20% of the people will take over 80% of the conversation every single time. And so the idea is, yes, leaders, like Herman was saying, you need to reach out more, but also use technology. There are various ways that you can gather more intelligence about people's thinking and thoughts and ideas without having to just have a conversation, if that makes sense.
So Bernice, I was going to ask you the question about how do you maintain culture in a remote environment, but you're adding to that question, the two of you, by saying, yes, let's ask the question about how do we maintain the culture, but also how do we smash the culture? Because this is a crisis opportunity to change the way that we've been doing things that may have been imperfect. So let me hit you with both of those questions. Sort of one is, how do we maintain this sense of connective tissue between people while it looks like we're going to be in some form of remote for a significant period of 2021 at a minimum? And then the second is, what should chief administrative officers be thinking about taking this opportunity to challenge their cultures and think differently? And I'm going to bring you back to your core business. What role does real estate play in that?
Exactly. So let me take the first one around culture. And like I said, it's very important to be intentional about your culture. But if you haven't taken the time to actually define your culture, you're not going to know what it is. Like Herman was saying, there's good aspects of your culture, and there are probably some bad aspects of your culture. There are things that are not written down. So it's important for people to really understand, so how do we define our culture? How do we want people to speak up? Or are they going to get shot down? You have to define what the talk is and then walk the talk. There are companies, for instance, like GitLab, that have never, ever, ever had any offices at all. They're a 100% remote company, and they are very intentional about their culture. In fact, you can certainly Google what they say about how to onboard people, how to create those social connections when you're not meeting people. And I'm not advocating that for all companies. What I'm saying is there are ways to overcome the challenges of being fully remote. In fact, I would ask all of you to think back to pre-pandemic days when you did a conference call and you got on the phone, you never did video, you never did Zoom, you really didn't know anything about people. And now we've had this wonderful window into people's personal lives. I have opened up my window into my home office, into Herman's spectacular home office. I would never have known a lot of things about Herman if I hadn't seen what's going on in his office. The footballs, the West Point rug. There's a lot of things that have opened up a greater sense of authenticity with our colleagues and with our clients or our friends that we never really saw before. Yes, we're not traveling like we used to. We're not having the same kinds of meetings, but we've had this other kind of authenticity that's come into this around, so the culture piece is really, really important and being intentional. And then your next question was around real estate, right? So when you think about post-pandemic and you think about the fact that 70% of people say, yeah, I want to come back to the office, but really only 2 or 3 days a week. Okay. So what are they going to come back to the office for? Well, it's not going to be to do heads down work. They can do that at home. They can do that in a third place. So the whole idea of the office will be a place for those social connections. That's the number one thing that people miss about the office: socializing with their colleagues, those special events where they can just connect with people. They really miss face-to-face work. And so the office will become a place for social connection, for convening for events, for collaboration on and solving some complex business problems and challenges that you can't really do as well in a virtual way. So preparing the office for things like that. So can you repurpose space? Can you look at how you will create a social hub for people? Where's the beating heart of your organization or your state in your office? Where do people go to connect? It's not just to get coffee in a pantry, right? And so real estate, defining the purpose of place in this virtual and remote world is a critical thing to be thinking about right now. And there's a lot of, visioning that can be done with your leaders. Listening to what employee preferences are can help shape what that overall strategy should be for the workplace.
Bernice, I think you hit on a couple of different things that are so critical, and really what we're hearing from our state chief administrators are nagging to them. The human connection is so critical. And overnight, we were out of the office, individuals in their homes, really having a hard time separating work from home life and personal time. And so we are yearning to come back and work together as a group, but we're also thinking about perhaps our states are looking to release some real estate or change what that landscape and that footprint looks like. So, many of our states are thinking about shared spaces, hoteling. How do we continue to lead them in that direction while also thinking about that human connection and really what that means for our chief administrators?
Well, let me
It's
start on that one. Give Bernice a chance to catch her breath. There's no doubt we put together for a couple of states. We put together information papers on just that concept, Pam. And the idea is this is a little bit of seeing around the corners where states have become very accustomed to parceling out real estate by department, right? So that means we've got 7 to 10 departments, and each of one of them has, for each of their locations, they have a reception area, they've got conference rooms, they've got parking, et cetera, et cetera. So the duplicity of what is replicated by the state is something. So one of the white papers we put together, and I'll be happy to share with anyone, concern saying, well, think of it as pods in the community, right? So as opposed to, and think of the things that you do. So the use of technology, making sure that you have the appropriate space can be used by multi-departments, and think about what this does, not only for your employees, but for the environment, right? We talk about the environmental part of it. So if I don't have to go all the way across town, passing 2 or 3 state offices to get to where I go, it's not only time, but it's also the environment, gas, emissions, et cetera, et cetera. So there are ways, but what this is going to take, it's going to take smashing the old rule of I'm Department X and I own this real estate and this is what we're going to do to it. When this point of, it's kind of like, I've jumped out of an airplane. You jump out of the airplane and you've got to trust that that parachute is going to come out. You count to 3, you look up, you see the sky, you pull your reserve. But in this instance, they're going to have to, unfortunately, I've just seen it over too many states. It's not going to happen. It's normally not going to happen automatically. Somebody is going to, by fiat, have to say, this department, this department, this department, you're going to work together. And I would suggest some demonstration type projects, because you'll be able to think about it. You're putting 3 different conference rooms together. Think if you took those resources and did one really cool one with all of the technology you need. So I've got one that can hold 50 people, and I've got a whole bunch from 10 people to 2 people to 101. So it can be done, and I'm looking forward to some states stepping out of the comfort zone, and it's going to have to be dictated, I'm afraid.
Herman, I think we all know that the first time you jump out of a plane, somebody's shoving you. So is that so this is fascinating. Just to summarize what I'm hearing, at least, is Bernice, to your point, social connection, everybody's focused on it and everybody's talking about it. Defining your culture, not just letting your culture develop, but actually taking that time as a chief administrative officer to define what that culture is. I love the phrase, the beating heart of your organization. Define where that is. What is that going to look like? How is it going to feel to people when they pass through that beating heart? And then Herman, jumping to you is this idea. So what you're suggesting is I might work for the State Department of Transportation, but I may choose to work out of a legacy office that used to be part of Department of Fisheries, because now it's a state office that's really cool and it's got good technology and it's a good place to work. But it might be 5 miles from my house instead of 25 miles from my house. Am I understanding that correctly? Love that.
Yes.
Yeah. So in the last few minutes that we have, Pam, maybe we ask both Herman and Bernice, if you were a CAO right now, and lots of them in the middle of legislative sessions and being asked difficult questions about costs and budgets and how we're using real estate from state legislators, what are the 3 things that you would be thinking about on your morning walk or your morning run with respect to return to work? What are the sort of 3 big questions they should be asking themselves?
Bernice?
How are you going to support the health and well-being of your employees? Number 1. Okay, there's a lot of concern about some people have no intention of ever getting back on public transportation. They really don't want to come back to the office. I'm talking even a post-vaccine period. So understanding how you're going to support health and well-being is critical, number 1. From the standpoint of the states, I'm also thinking about how are you going to go about reducing your overhead and your operating cost. And so in order to do that, as a workplace strategist, I'm encouraging all of my and working with clients on the private sector side to look at what are those job functions that really could be working from home 4 to 5 days a week. What are those job functions that should be back in the office 4 to 5 days a week? And which jobs can flex in between? 60 to 70% or even 80% of your population might be able to just come into the office 2 to 3 days a week. That's going to help you size the box. Okay. For many corporate clients, they will be reducing their footprint. It helps them reduce their carbon footprint. So those two things, and also defining the purpose of the office in the future. So you understand with the real estate that's left, what you should do to support the nature of work and your mission and your values would be the top 3 questions I'd want to answer.
And to add to that, I'm going to start with people, and I would suggest that they start some type of telephone ladder to make sure that they're checking in on particularly their direct reports, and they want to even spot check on others in their organizations. I know it's impossible to call everybody, but just that the word gets out, hey, Kara called me and she was concerned about how I felt, et cetera, et cetera. So that's number one, the people. The second one is I would ask myself, how can I be innovative and think out of the box, right? We know what the standard response is, make sure I pay the bills on time and make sure it's clean and make that. What is something that I can really do that I have confidence, whether it's changing a process, whether it's Scott going after that process of getting more of a shared services concept, getting that done. And the third thing I would do is get some idea, go to the governor and or the chief of staff before the end of this month with some really great idea that's out of the box. Don't wait to be told what to do. Come up with that idea. So I'm explaining something that's called entrepreneurship. Don't wait to be told what to do. See a problem, come up with a solution, and there will always be, but we can't do it, but we can't do that. But leaders get through those buts and they make it happen.
So be proactive in your creativity and manage the real estate discussion proactively, not reactively. Yeah, it's a big lift. A couple of comments from our attendees. We have Gail who's commenting that she actually just is more productive wearing business attire and wants to wear those clothes that's in the wardrobe that she wore for work because it's a prompting. There's a whole raft of psychology around this, Gail, that you're not going crazy. There's a lot of psychology behind this that tells you that that is true. And then just reiteration of the office is the celebration. It's the place that you come together and it's that cohesiveness. I sort of love that concept. Pam, we are at time. Herman and Bernice, thank you so much for your contributions. Thank you for your year trying to reinvent your industry as everybody is reinventing what they've been doing themselves as well as supporting your clients. Pam, going back to you.
Thanks, Scott and Herman and Bernice. I know you all have a wealth of just wonderful and very insightful resources on JLL's website. So to all of our attendees, please reach out. And again, thanks to both of you for saying how critically important it is to check on our employees.